Okay, so obviously I'm going to be taking you through War Photographer, written by Caroline Duffy. Obviously a very well-known poet and someone that perhaps you've sort of considered for other poems as well. So we're looking at War Photographer, and this poem was actually published in 1985, which is actually quite important to be aware of in terms of context. So I'll just make a note of that. And the title itself is quite interesting too, because I would imagine that most of us think about war journalists or just journalists rather than actually war photographers. And that, in a sense, is quite important too, because now when we think about sort of war, we often think about images we've seen courtesy of the news, probably less so in terms of newspapers now, simply because we are starting to rely more and more on social media, on sort of videos perhaps rather than actual still images. So what is this poem about? It is about a war photographer, but Caroline Duffy, of course, was not a war photographer herself, but she did have many friends. She had some very, very close friends who were war photographers, and they were very, very famous, and they were well known at that time, 1985, prior to 1985, after 1985, for producing some really sort of iconic and very emotive pictures from conflict zones. So the poem then is not about Caroline Duffy's own experiences, it's about her listening to her friends, maybe looking at the images that they've produced and considering what it must have been like to take pictures, going to the war zones and then taking pictures, the choices that war photographers had to make, the fact that sometimes they would see people dying, people hurt, people suffering, and their job was to simply take the picture and maybe not think about what had caused the event, what the consequences of that event might be. So they had to take the picture and then leave and move on. And I think this poem is actually asking us to consider whether that's really possible. So very, very basic overview then. If we think about what is this poem about, well, we have 4 stanzas or 4 verses. And in the first stanza, we obviously have references to the war photographer himself. So in his dark room, he is finally alone, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. The only light is red and softly glows, as though this were a church, and he a priest preparing to intone a mass. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass. So in the first stanza, it is about the war photographer coming home, and he is starting to produce, to create his photographs. And actually, when we think about creating photographs, we probably think about smartphones, we think about sort of all the wide range of cameras we have now that will give us the best quality pictures. But in 1985, it is very likely that the war photographer would have taken the pictures on a camera, and then he would have come home and he would have processed them in a dark room, which would have involved chemicals, it would have involved red lights, no light. So very, very sort of time-consuming process, so very, very different to the fact that we click a button and then straight away we have an image in front of us. Second stanza then actually starts to really sort of play into sort of his life at home. So he has a job to do, solution slops and trays beneath his hands, which do not tremble then, though seem to now. Rural England, home again, to ordinary pain, which simple weather can dispel, to fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. So again, we have references to his home life, but we are also starting to get contrasts. We're starting to get some sense that what this war photographer sees when he's at work, when he's overseas, when he's in these areas of conflict, are so very, very different to the calmness of his home life. Then in the third stanza, we get another change in focus. Something is happening. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes, a half-formed ghost. He remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. So what we're hearing here is the fact that the photograph is starting to emerge. So we're starting to sort of see what the war photographer himself is seeing, and we're getting a sense of the horror, of the agony that he has been asked to capture as part of his job. 100 agonies in black and white, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. From the aeroplane he stares impassively at where he earns his living, and they do not care. So At the start of the poem, obviously, we have the war photographer coming home, starting to develop his pictures. And then at the end of the poem, we have references to the fact that this war photographer may have taken hundreds of pictures, but his boss, the editor, or her boss, the editor, will have to pick out maybe 5 or 6 that will appear on the front cover, or maybe even inside a newspaper. And then he's off again. He's off to go and take some more pictures. So it does seem that it's quite sort of a routine, it's quite restricted. He does his job, he comes home, he gives the pictures to his boss, he goes away again. And structure and routine are quite important points to make reference to now, because as I mentioned, there are 4 stanzas, 4 verses, and actually when you start to sort of really look at them, they have a very tight, very sort of really structured form to them. So if you count them, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So each stanza consists of 6 lines. And there's also a very, very structured sort of rhyme pattern as well. So if you think about it, a lone rose doesn't work. So we've got A, then we've got B. Rose and glows does work, the rhyme, so we've got B. He and mass, there's no rhyme there, so we go C. Mass and grass, actually they do rhyme, so we've got D, D. So A, B, B, C, D, D. And this pattern actually continues throughout the whole of the poem. So we have this strict sort of routine or strict sort of pattern emerging. And that's really, really interesting because it contrasts so much with the chaos that possibly this war photographer experiences. So at home, there's order, there's calmness, but away from home, where he's taken those pictures, there is absolute chaos. So we could argue that the structure creates that contrast that Duffy is maybe looking for. So sticking with structure then, we don't always just have to look at sort of rhyme at the end of a poem, or at the end of a line rather. We can actually look at what's going on within a line. And I'm going to actually draw your attention to sort of the 3rd line from the bottom. So we're looking at line 22. So the reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. Now, what you may have noticed actually is that we've got the rhyme tears and beers, and we often call that internal rhyme. And it could be suggested that what we see here is that Caroline Duffy is trying to make a really, really clear point. So this war photographer has given loads and loads of pictures to his editor. The editor has picked maybe 2 or 3 that he's decided to put on the front cover or in the newspaper. And we, the consumer, we're looking through the paper and we look at that picture and we go, oh, that's awful, that's terrible. But then we move on really, really quickly and we go for a shower, we go for a bath, we get ready to go out, we go and enjoy ourselves, we have some beers, we have some lunch. And it is possible that the reason why we've got this internal rhyme is because Caroline Duffy wants us to realise that there is this tiny, tiny sort of gap between us feeling really, really sad and then moving on and just forgetting about the conflict. And that could be something else that possibly Duffy wants us to consider, that unfortunately a war photographer will go and take these pictures, will try to tell us, the audience, the consumer, the British public, that terrible, terrible things are going on. Maybe move to a minute or 2 minutes, 3 minutes, but eventually our everyday life will get the better of us and we will forget. And in some ways, I think Duffy's asking us, don't forget, don't sort of focus too much on your own life. Remember that there is suffering, that there is horrific events taking place around the world. That's just one idea, one interpretation. If we're sticking with structure then, there's another point that I think is really, really worthwhile sort of considering. And again, it links a little bit to contrast, it links a little bit to this idea that all these horrors are taking place elsewhere, at home, we're safe, we're secure. So if we're looking at the second stanza, you may see that rural England, we might call it a very, very short line, a very short sentence, but actually we have a full stop, then we have rural England, then we have full stop. We often call that caesura. And that actually, again, is quite an interesting sort of technique being used by Duffy. And what it does seem to suggest is that rural England, home, it's isolated, it's all alone. You know, we're able to sort of distance ourselves from the harshness of war, from the suffering, from the agonies being faced by the people that are having their photograph taken by the war photographer. So again, it's that contrast between the chaos and the calm. So we've talked a little bit about structure, we've talked about the number of stanzas, we've talked about sort of the rhyme, internal rhyme, we've talked about caesura. Of course, we've looked at the title as well, and sort of the concept of the war photographer and perhaps what inspired the poem, why Caroline Duffy wanted to write it. It would be really ridiculous not to consider language as well. So when I'm looking at this poem straight away, I'm picking out words that perhaps really grab my attention. We often call them neon words. So I'm starting with spools of suffering. That really does grab my attention. If I go a little bit further, I might start to pick out the word tremble, and I want to have a little think about the word tremble. Ordinary pain. We've got explode, running children, nightmare heat. If we keep going then, we've got this half-formed ghost appearing in the third stanza. We've got cries. We've got blood stained. Into the fourth stanza, we've got agonies. So looking at this particular poem, we start to sort of see there's a lot of sort of language that we do associate with suffering, that we do associate with people in pain, people who are struggling on a day-to-day basis. So in terms of language, I might just make a note of the fact that we've got sort of negative language. But it's not just negative, it's also very emotive. You can't help but think of the word suffering or the word agonies and not sort of feel some level of empathy. And again, I think that's what Caroline Duffy is asking us to do. She wants us to empathise with the people who are suffering in the pictures. We've got that contrast because if we go to the second stanza, we've got rural England, home again to ordinary pain. So again, Duffy suggesting that what we experience is nothing in comparison to what people are having to live with. So we have, you know, warm climates, we have, you know, our daily sort of routines, we have sort of problems, but nothing in comparison. We don't have explosions, we don't have children running, we don't have this nightmare heat, which could represent bombs, it could represent explosions, it could represent the enemy. If we go a little bit further then, again, I think the third stanza, possibly for me, but maybe for many other people, sort of is the most emotive, because there is a strong suggestion that this man is going to die, and that perhaps becomes apparent because of the reference to the word ghost, or maybe even because the word cries maybe conveys this idea that this woman is clearly devastated at her husband's injuries. And there does seem to be some suggestion that this man can't give approval himself, he can't say, yes, take my picture, maybe because he is so badly injured, maybe because he's not there anymore. The word blood, again, perhaps sort of is almost metaphorical for sort of lots of people suffering, lots of loss of life, lots of injury. And that's reinforced 100 agonies, the idea that this suffering is vast, that it's not sort of one person, it's many people. So I think if I was sort of summarising this poem, I think what I'd want to go away and have a little think about is the fact that this is a poem about a man doing his job. It's about a man who has to do a very, very difficult job. He has to take pictures. That means that sometimes he can't step in and do anything about the conflict. He can't ease someone's suffering. He can't offer them medical assistance. He can't offer them food or water. He has to move on and take the next picture. And I think we would like to imagine that it doesn't affect him, but actually I think in reality it does affect him. I think the fact that possibly his hands tremble maybe just gives us an indication that he doesn't leave his work behind him, that it does come home with him. I think the fact that he's in his quiet, dark room, sort of processing his pictures, and the fact that he starts to see the picture, he starts to remember this man, and the fact that possibly he is haunted by the cries, he remembers the cries, I think that does highlight that this is someone who is struggling to deal with what he sees and what he does. The fact that he's angry that potentially the pictures he's taken don't really have the impact he wants them to have, that possibly he wants people to have a stronger response and he wants people to be more angry or upset because that's how he feels about what he's seeing, what pictures he's taken. In terms of links to other poems then, I suppose memory is a great link. So you could think about how memory is crucial in Remains, and the idea that the memory of killing the looter never leaves the soldier.